This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies at the Jewish Theological Center in New York, and he's the author of a new book entitled Aphrodite and the Rabbis, How Jews Adapted Roman Culture to Create Judaism as We Know It. It was recently published by St. Martin's Press. He's now joining us on the line from the Big Apple, Rabbi Burton Visotzky. Welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me, Gilad. I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks very much. Okay, so it kind of goes without saying that the Romans were the biggest enemies of the Jews ever, second perhaps only to Hitler. So there are two ways to understand the argument you make in the book that Roman culture was instrumental in the creation of Judaism. Either we were told lies all along, or that Burton L. Visotzky is a very courageous man.
I think neither nor, actually. And I would take your analogy of Rome and Germany as one that I think is an effective argument. You can't talk about Germany and the Nazis without also focusing on the fact that much of German Jewish culture created us as we are today, that the German Jews gave us a lot of gifts that to this very day we continue to celebrate as modern Judaism. And I think that was the case also in the Roman Empire thousands of years ago. It's true that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple, and in some way effectively ended Israelite religion. We no longer offered sacrifices at the Beit HaMikdash. That said, Roman culture gave us the very means by which we were able to survive that disaster and essentially create a rabbinic culture that we continue to celebrate to this very day.
Mm-hmm. So was it just perhaps a technical development that, they just eradicated one sort of worship and gave rise to another, or was it more substantial than that?
There's no minimizing the disaster that occurred when Jerusalem was destroyed. We had for 1,000 years been worshiping God in a certain way, and that was animal sacrifice in Jerusalem at the Beit HaMikdash. And that came abruptly to an end, and when it did, after the revolt against Rome, and I hasten to point out that we Jews revolted against Rome, and we were crushed. But that said, we had to reconsider what Judaism would be. After all, even to this very day, when we open a Torah scroll, Sefer Vayikra is at the center of that scroll. Animal sacrifice is what we are supposed to be doing, I guess, to propitiate God, but we don't do that any longer. Instead, we have substituted a very, very different system, a system that puts Torah study at the center of our culture. And Torah study is, I dare say, somewhat different than shechting an animal on an altar.
Yeah. So would you say that it's thanks to the Romans in the sense that did they offer anything of their own culture that gave rise to this kind of worship, or was it just the Jews were at wit's end and really tried to circumvent the disaster that befell them and find a creative new way?
Well, I think a little of both. That is to say, we were well before the destruction thoroughly immersed in Greco-Roman and Hellenistic culture. If you look at the classics of rabbinic literature, the Talmud and the Midrashim, one of the things that's startling is there are maybe between 3,000 and 4,000 loan words from Greek and Latin into our Hebrew texts. Mm-hmm. That kind of penetration of culture means something. The Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud of the land of Israel, tells us that there were cities in the Galilee where they recited Kriyat Shema in Greek. Now, that is not insignificant. It means that they were taking sections of the Torah, because the Shema is, after all, 3 sections of the Torah, and they were reciting it in Greek. That may well mean that their Torah scroll was even in Greek. It's kind of startling for us to think that in Eretz Yisrael, the language of worship might have been Greek. But if you look at the excavations in the Galilee, and you look at the synagogues of the Galilee, and by the way, the word synagogue is a nice Greek word. If you look at the synagogues in the Galilee, you will find that about half of the inscriptions are indeed in Greek. And so we begin to see that Greek culture played an essential role. The penetration of that culture is ubiquitous. It affects the way we do Jewish law. It affects the way we interpret Scripture. It affects the way we tell Jewish stories. Indeed, it even affects things like the Passover Seder. So virtually all of our rabbinic culture is something that is comfortably also part of the Western world.
Would you say that in this sense they were the first Reformed Jews, in the sense that they really adapted to the dominant culture around them and opened up?
No, I would not say they were the first Reformed Jews. I would say they were Jews. This is what we Jews do. Even today, the Haredim, I mean, they're quite happy using computers and electronics. We live in the world around us. It's the world that God created, and the way we serve God is living in God's world. So we adapt. We constantly adapt. And I think that faced with the destruction of Yerushalayim, there was a possibility, I think a real possibility, that Yahadut could have come to an end. But instead, we took the best from Roman culture. We left out the paganism, as it were, the polytheism. We focused on God and the ways in which we want to worship God. And that allowed us to live on and to adapt and to become Judaism as we know it.
Why do you think that is? It wasn't an informed decision, was it?
Well, I don't know. There are, in rabbinic literature, there are a variety of points of view. That almost goes without saying because it's Jewish literature, so there will always be a variety of points of view. But some rabbis found Rome and everything about Rome absolutely anathema. They hated it. Some rabbis embraced it with open arms, and other rabbis were neutral. So for those who hated it, they understood that the adaptation of Roman culture could present a danger. For those that greeted it with open arms, they saw it as a way to continue. So I think there's debate within the literature itself and within Jewish culture, ad hayom hazeh, even today, wherein we don't know how we relate our Jewish identity to the culture around us. And we're constantly in that push-pull culturally.
What was the reaction of the Romans to it?
I think the Romans were curious. They had always respected the Jews as an ancient religion. That was terribly important. Antiquity meant something to them. And as it happens, a long, long time ago, we Jews seem to have bet on Julius Caesar so that the Romans gave the Jews special privilege within the empire. For many, many centuries, the Romans got along with the Jews. It was only when we Dafka rebelled against them that they had to then react. But otherwise, I think they saw Judaism and Jewish culture as very much part of their own, one more of the many groups. You know, we know even when the Beit HaMikdash stood, that the Roman emperor sent sacrifices every day for the welfare of the empire to the Beit HaMikdash. So there was a get along, go along, live and let live attitude of Rome.
How long before the destruction of the temple did it start? Over how many years did it evolve?
Well, I think from the earliest times, a book in the Tanakh like Kohelet or Daniel already has some reflexes of Greco-Roman Hellenism in it. And then, of course, with the Maccabees, one way of seeing the Maccabees is a revolt against everything Greek. But another way of seeing the Maccabees, looking at the books of the Maccabees themselves, looking at the names of the Maccabees, is that the war of the Maccabees was a war about whether we should wholly assimilate to Rome or whether we should just take the best of Greek Roman culture, really Greek culture then, and nevertheless still forge a very firm Jewish identity. And I think that's always been our choice. We opt for Jewish identity and a strong Jewish identity, while at the same time taking the best of Western culture and adapting it to our own use.
Do you think that the Greco-Roman, looking back on a millennia of Jewish history, do you think that the Greco-Roman culture had more influence on Judaism than other civilizations and cultures that the Jews lived in?
Well, it's a little hard at this point to separate. I'm not a Bible scholar, so I can't tell you the extent to which Ugaritic or Canaanite culture had an effect on us. But I can say for the last 2 millennia that Roman Western culture has been enormous in its influences, not the least of which because Christianity is also a manifestation of Greco-Roman culture. It's something that Judaism and Christianity actually share in common, so that the cultural milieu, whether it's living under Christianity or living under pagan Rome, has always been a milieu that has an effect on Jewish identity and Jewish creativity.
Mm-hmm. And what about Babylonian culture, where the sizable chunk of rabbinic literature emerged?
Actually, Gilad, you asked quite a wonderful question, because for years we read the Bavli as though it were a work, or a series of works, I guess, a lot of books in the Bavli. We read the Bavli as though it were created in a vacuum. And only in the last 2 decades have rabbinic scholars of Talmud, begun to research the relationship of Jewish Babylonia to Sasanian Zoroastrian culture. And there, too, they're finding that there is influence of the outside culture in the ways the rabbis of Bavel created Babylonian Judaism.
Were there also traces of Greco-Roman culture in Babylonia at the time? Because the Roman Empire did reach that region too.
It's actually, for me, a very complicated question you're asking, because the Sasanian and Persian and Parthian empires were enemies of Rome for all of those centuries. That said, you're quite right that there nevertheless was Roman influence at a place on the border like Dura Europus, where we still have a 3rd century synagogue and the remains of that synagogue and the art from that synagogue. We see that the Jewish characters who are depicted on the walls are all wearing Roman dress. So obviously there was some Roman influence. And of course, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, the rabbinic Jews of Eretz Yisrael, when they brought the Mishnah and they brought rabbinic teaching to Bavel, clearly brought Roman culture along with them.
What do you think are the principal tenets of rabbinic Judaism that emerged after the destruction of the temple, and what is particularly or essentially Greco-Roman about it?
Well, it's a little bit hard to sort out. To start with, let's not forget that the Torah and the Tanakh are Jewish documents, even though they are ultimately edited by the rabbis. These are old Semitic documents. So when Rabbi Akiva tells us that V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, klal gadol b'Torah, he's not exactly telling us something that's Greco-Roman. He's telling us that's quintessentially Jewish, biblical, ancient. That said, loving your neighbor as yourself in the broader context of Rome also means somehow that the rabbis had to grapple with the fact that we had to love our pagan neighbors as well as our Jewish neighbors. So that might be an example where it's difficult to sort out. Rabban Gamliel, when he talks about Seder Leil Pesach, says that we are Chayav Adam Lomar Pesach, Matzah, Umaror. So Pesach, the Paschal lamb, Matzah, the food we eat, Maror, the bitter herbs, those are all indeed mentioned in the Torah. That said, the overarching structure of Seder Leil Pesach, the Passover Seder, that structure is essentially the structure of a Greco-Roman symposium dinner. So we've taken the Roman frame and put it on the biblical commandments and created something very new, the Seder, instead of the sacrifice at the Beit HaMikdash, which we could no longer do.
What can you tell us about a Roman symposium and how it is really parallel to the Seder as we know it?
Well, it's actually quite a marvelous example, because the symposium is quite literally symposium, a party in which people gather together, symposium, to drink. What do they drink? They drink wine. They mix the wine, as we say in the Mishnah, Mazgulo Kos Rishon. We always mix the wine with water. In the Roman symposium, they had 3 or more cups of wine. We, of course, have 4 or more cups of wine. The symposium was driven by the food they ate. The food led to questions. In fact, the questions were always answered by quotations from what they called their sacred literature, usually Homer. So we ask questions about the food, Manish Tanach halayla hazeh. We answer the questions by quoting the Tanakh, our sacred literature. The Romans, for example, have a debate in symposia literature, a book from the 2nd, 3rd century, actually just about the time of the Mishnah, in which they debate whether this should be an appetizer or a dessert. What is it they're debating? A mixture of fruit, nuts, wine, and spices meshed together. And ultimately, Heraclides of Tarentum decides, no, it should be an appetizer. This is, of course, what we now call charoset. And I think our rabbis knew that charoset was borrowed from the Hellenistic world, because we don't say a baracha over charoset, but we do eat it. So that's another example. Indeed, the Mishnah is very, very clear in telling us that at the Passover Seder, ein maftirin achar hapesach afikoman, which the Babylonian Talmud, where they didn't know Greek, says that we shouldn't have the afikoman after the Paschal meal. What is the afikoman? One rabbi says dessert. But in Eretz Yisrael, they knew that it meant apekomias. We shouldn't go off to the comedians, because a symposium dinner ended with burlesque. Literally, comedians came out, they told dirty jokes, and then at a symposium, they had something called flute girls. Apparently, they did not actually play the flute, they did something else. And so the rabbis drew a firm line. We have taken the order of the symposium, but we're not going to degrade ourselves with dirty jokes. We're not going to degrade ourselves with flute girls. Adarabah, what we will do at the Seder, even if it is a symposium, is we will sing our praise to God for having taken us out of Egypt.
How interesting. You said that they probably were aware that they were adopting Hellenistic customs. Was there really no resentment even then in real time against the Romans and the Greeks for all the trouble that they had given the Jews?
Of course there was. First of all, we never lose sight of the fact that the Second Temple was destroyed. On Tisha B'Av, we commemorated along with the destruction of the First Temple. And in that period of the summer, we commemorate other things that we attribute to disasters that the Greeks and Romans perpetuated. Second of all, there were Jews who bitterly resented Rome. The Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, when he was confronted with the fact that the Romans have given us marketplaces, the Romans have built bridges, said, yeah, well, their marketplaces are for their prostitutes to ply their trade, and the bridges are just so that the Romans can collect a toll. So not atypically, and it's true even today, there are Jews who bitterly reject any intrusion of the outside world, any improvement of the outside world, any whiff that something might not be pure Yiddishkeit, as though there once were such a thing. Mm-hmm. And then there are Jews who say, no, we actually recognize these as things that benefit us. And I think that's always the conflict within the Jewish community in Talmudic times and today.
When was the balance tipped in favor of those who were actually for incorporating Hellenistic elements into Jewish religion?
It's not clear that the balance has been tipped yet, Gilad. We are constantly struggling about what is authentic Jewish identity. Does authentic Jewish identity include the possibility of women rabbis? Well, here at my seminary, it does. In many places in Israel and at other seminaries in the United States, it emphatically does not. Yet that is, I think, a very clear sign of what it means to be living in modernity. So that debate continues. In the Talmud, surely sometimes explicitly and often implicitly, Greco-Roman norms, language, things like that have been utterly acculturated. Sometimes the rabbis aren't even aware of it. Even in our Sidur, when we pray, we use a Greek word when we pray. When we say lahodot, lahalel, l'shabach, l'faer, l'ramem, lahader, ulikales. The word ulikales comes from the Greek word kalos. It's the way that the Romans and Greeks praise the emperor, and it's the way the Jews praise the Kodesh Baruch Hu.
How interesting. All right, Rabbi Burton Visotzky, a professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies and the author of the new book, Aphrodite and the Rabbis, How Jews Adapted Roman Culture to Create Judaism as We Know It. Thank you very much for joining us today.
And thanks so much for having me.
And also big thanks to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Gilad_Halpern. I tweet mainly about the review, and don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
We were over and over again, walking around, walking down, washing it down in circles, over and over again. I hear you call me, over and over again. I hear you call my name. We were torn by the love and the game, a silent affair. We both never dared to follow. We had thoughts glorifying this love, growling in silence to tigers of violence in search